Welcome back to Ales and Fails Miniatures. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different on this channel. We're actually going to be crafting these collapsed tunnels and rubble piles to match my Dwarven Forge. It's been a project that's been on my docket for a little while, so I thought I'd hammer it out and show you guys how it's done. Let's get into it. So the first thing to do here is try to determine what size hallway you're going to be working with the Dwarven Forge. In my case, I decided to go with 2 singular walls, and I also grabbed a corner just to maybe do something with that as well. First, I start here by going into my scrap bin from previous projects and grabbing some of these bigger pieces of foam that are left over, and then taking them down and cutting them into triangles to give myself a sturdy base, and then filling any additional gaps just to make sure that it is snug within the walls. And then I stick these together using hot glue for a nice quick bond so that I don't have to have any additional waiting time on this step. Then when testing it again, I realized it was a little tight, so I took my scalpel here and just trimmed a little bit of excess off. After assuring it fit, I just took this clay sculpting tool and basically just drug it along to carve little gaps within it, and then I can take my fingers and just pluck these off to give it a little bit more of a rock texture. The next step here was to take some of those leftover pieces of foam that I had grabbed and just start picking at them until they slightly resemble a rock. And then taking a ball of tinfoil to give it additional rock texture and picking off anything that doesn't look quite right. Keeping all these extra pieces every time you do this and making sure you make a lot of these rocks. Once I have a decent amount of these rocks, I just take some hot glue and start gluing them in random places, making sure to not do any specific pattern to try to make it look as natural as possible. Since this is supposed to be a man-made tunnel that has collapsed, I took a piece of foam and pressed it down onto my Dwarven Forge, giving me an imprint where I can cut these out into the individual bricks. Once I had quite a few of those, I took the tinfoil and did the exact same thing, giving them a little bit more texture, and then plucking a few pieces off here and there just to make them look like they broke during the fall. And then glued them on using hot glue as well. Once I had quite a few of them in place, I went back with the tinfoil ball just to make sure all surfaces did have texture. The next thing I did here is grab some balsa wood and then just score it with my scalpel just to give it additional wood texture. And any pieces that came off, I just ripped off, showing more wear and tear. Once I did that to all sides, I went back with my wire brush just to make those a little bit deeper and give additional texture to the rest of the wood as well. And then I broke it down into smaller pieces to add to the rubble pile. Once I had quite a few pieces of this balsa wood, I just took it and hot glued it into random places, shoving it deep within the rocks just to make sure that it looks like it's not just all sitting on the surface and is actually sticking out of different pieces of this, looking like supports from the previous structure. Once I felt like I had enough pieces of wood put in place, I went back and just continuously added smaller bricks to make it look more natural. Since this entire piece was made out of foam, it was a little light, so I wanted to add a little weight to the base of it. I did this by grabbing a couple of washers and then cutting around them with a scalpel, going deep enough to make sure I could stack quite a few of them in there. Once I had a nice line, I took the pliers and pulled out any additional pieces to make sure that the washers would actually fit, and then I just hot glued them in place. Once the washers were in place, I went back with the hot glue gun and filled any additional gaps just to give additional support, and then pressed it down onto a piece of parchment paper to make sure it's flat. For the cavern, I did the exact same thing, just without the wood and without the bricks. For the corner pieces, I also did the same thing. I just instead used a piece of foam that was already at a 90-degree angle, and then cut it down to make sure that it fit. For this next step, I took some Eileen's tacky glue, watered it down a little bit so that it would flow, and then put it on any flat areas and in between any cracks. Once I had glue in all the areas that I wanted, I took a mix of aquarium gravel and sand, and then drizzled it on top of this. This will symbolize the smaller pieces of gravel that would have fallen in the collapse. Once all that was thoroughly dry, I went through and added the Black Magic Craft black paint and Mod Podge layer. This just helps the foam be a little bit more rigid and makes it to where I can use a rattle can on it later, along with giving a nice base coat for paint. For the base coat on this, I did have to use a custom paint. What you see on screen there is the Dwarven Forge base coat, and I don't think it matches perfectly, so I did have to go in and add a little bit of green paint to it. But once I did that, it seems to match pretty well. Here I'm just trying to get into each individual crack and cranny, making sure that I give a thorough base coat so that there's no additional foam left over. The next step here is to go in with Earthstone from Dwarven Forge and just paint random bricks on the piece, just like you would see on a normal Dwarven Forge tile, just to give it a little bit of variety. Once you have a good array of bricks painted, the next step is to do a dry brush. The same thing happened here where the dry brush from Dwarven Forge didn't quite match. It was a little bit more tan when in the actual tiles were kind of yellow, so I just added a little bit of yellow paint to it and went through and did a thorough dry brush to bring out all the ridges and texture. Once all the tiles were dry brushed, the next step was to go back and paint all of the wood brown. This is another custom paint, just brown, black, and tan mixed together to give a little bit more earthy tones because wood isn't actually just straight brown. The next step here for the wood is to go through with a golden brown and do a pretty heavy dry brush on it. And then the final step for the wood was to go through with a tan and do a pretty heavy dry brush again, almost covering all of the golden brown, but just leaving a little bit of variant to make it look more natural. Once all that was thoroughly dried, I grabbed some Agrax Earthshade from Citadel and started filling in all the cracks and on top of the sand and gravel and wood that I had painted earlier, just to help split up some of those tones. The final step for paint here was to take a black wash. Here I'm using Nuln Oil by Citadel and just going over all the tops of everything just to try to tone everything back down and make it all match. The last thing I did here was grab some Krylon Flat Crystal Clear and just gave everything a thorough coating of it to help protect that paint. So as you can see, it's a pretty simple, quick project. I think this only took me a total of like 8 hours or 10 hours to be honest. And the only reason why it took me so long is obviously drying times, things like that in between. But overall, I really enjoyed this one. Like I said, I had it on my docket there for a while, and I really am excited the fact that they're finally done. There's so many different uses for things like this. You can prop them up, not even on their bottom, but actually up on their sides to give additional heavier closed-in areas. But I really enjoyed this. I hope you guys did. If you did, please do like and subscribe. It does help us. And we'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.